So the mainline Pokemon games have been doing gimmicks for about 4 generations now, and unfortunately, I feel like they peaked with the very first one that they did. That one obviously being Mega Evolutions. So Mega Evolutions were introduced in Pokemon X and Y. They were super popular at the time. They still are to a very big extent. I mean, if you look at the most recently announced game, Pokemon Legends ZA, it was teased that Mega Evolutions would be coming back, and a lot of people were freaking out about it. But the reason Mega Evolutions were interesting was because it provided Pokemon that didn't have evolutions at all a way to evolve, even if it was temporary. It gave them a new look, a new ability, a new type possibly, a big stat boost, and it made them viable in a lot of ways. It also allowed Pokemon who had 3 stages in their evolution line to finally get a 4th one, kind of. And that's something that was, the topic of discussion in the playgrounds in the early 90s. As a kid, I remember always talking about Pokemon possibly having a 4th evolution, like Charizard getting a 4th evolution. And in a way, it kind of gave those Pokemon just that. So me and a lot of people felt like Mega Evolutions was just the thing that was going to be part of the franchise moving forward. That in the future generations, there were going to be new Mega Evolutions implemented, and it was just going to be part of the meta, and it was pretty interesting and exciting. We eventually got new Mega Evolutions with the remakes for Ruby and Sapphire, but when Generation 7 rolled around, there were no new Mega Evolutions around. Instead, a new mechanic was introduced called Z-Moves. Now, Z-Moves were basically a super powerful move that your Pokemon could use within the battle. You're able to give your Pokemon a specific stone that represents a type of a move that they have. And at any point in the battle, you're able to activate that Z-move and use it against your opponent. You're only able to do this once, so you really kind of have to figure, okay, when's the best time for me to use it? What's the best Z stone I should give this Pokemon, assuming it has 4 different moves or 4 different types? And sure, there was like a decent amount of strategy behind it, but I do feel like it felt a little empty at the end of the day. Since it was just a single move, I felt like it could either completely change the game or it could be a complete waste. And putting that much weight onto a single move, I feel like throws the balance of the battle way out of scale. Because a lot of battles were decided more or less by how well the Z-move was implemented, by how well the Z-move was used. And moves such as Protect, which typically negate a move completely from dealing damage to you. In this case, if you use Protect against the Z-move, you still do take damage from that Z-move, but I believe it was only about 25%. So it's not horrendous. You are still able to deal damage to your opponent, but obviously it's not the full impact of it. So on top of that, a lot of Pokemon would run Protect at that point, so it felt like a mess, and I didn't really love that gimmick at all. On the plus side, they did keep Mega Evolutions in Sun and Moon, so it's not like those were nowhere to be seen. So a lot of people felt like, okay, it looks like we're just going to be stacking on these gimmicks for every generation. And I was curious to see where the meta would go with all these new different mechanics implemented. And then we got Generation 8, Pokemon Sword and Shield. And in this game, Mega Evolutions were gone, Z-moves were gone, and instead, we got something called Dynamaxing. So Dynamaxing basically was a new mechanic that made your Pokemon grow into this giant kaiju-looking monster. More or less, the model of the Pokemon stayed the same. They got this new reddish hue to them, and they have these little reddish clouds kind of circling around them. Similar to Mega Evolutions, the Pokemon got a huge stat boost, but it was even more temporary than a Mega Evolution. So Mega Evolutions lasted the entire battle after you Mega Evolved, while Dynamaxing only lasts for 3 turns. So it's even more situational in that sense, where you really have to think about, all right, when's the best opportunity for me to activate this Dynamax ability that I can utilize it for the next 3 turns and really turn the tides of the battle. Now, it was such an impactful mechanic that it more or less destroyed singles as a whole, And when I say that, I mean the singles format versus, the doubles format, 1v1 versus 2v2. Just because when you play singles, when someone Dynamaxes before the other player, they already have such a huge advantage over them that it's basically done. They've already set the stage to the point where they're gonna win the whole match. In doubles, there's more leeway since you have two Pokemon on the field at once, and I guess you have a little bit more options. And personally, I like singles format a little bit more than doubles, so to me it was like a huge hit for competitive play. I didn't really play competitively at all that generation, so that was really a big downer for me in my opinion. Visually, it was also a bit disappointing since, again, the models stayed exactly the same, they just got really big. And there were certain situations where specific Pokemon did get unique models, and in this case they're called Gigantamaxing. And from what I can understand, it's more or less the same thing. Their models just change. I think the abilities change too with Pokemon, so they're just less impressive Mega Evolutions in my opinion. Like the Gigantamax versions of certain Pokemon straight up just look like they're inspired by Godzilla and Mothra and just those giant kaiju monsters from like other pop culture type of movies and things like that. But yeah, it wasn't that impressive for me, and I was kind of looking forward to see what the next thing was going to be. The fact that they did take out Mega Evolutions and Z-moves was just the precedent that they set going forward. Like, all right, every generation there's going to be a new gimmick, and only that gimmick. We're not going to recycle old gimmicks. It's just going to be that one for the generation, and the generation following that is going to have something completely different. So a message to the fans, don't get used to it. It's going to change in a few years. And a few years later, we got Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. The new gimmick this time is terrestrialization. So this mechanic is pretty interesting, I feel, technically speaking, because it basically changes the typing of your Pokemon. So strategically, it could really be a really interesting way to play the game. You could jump in with a Dragonite, for example. So you have a Dragon Flying type Pokemon, and you're up against an Ice type. So an Ice Beam is coming right at you, and your Dragonite might have a Terra type of Fire, for example. So all of a sudden, that Ice Beam is not going to be very effective. So you resist a move that originally was going to be able to deal 4 times super effective damage to you, throwing your opponent completely off guard, and maybe you can retaliate with a fire move. And since now you're a fire type, you get that stab bonus on top of it. So it's really interesting mechanic. Visually though, pretty big disappointment, since every single Pokemon is able to terrestrialize, similarly to Dynamaxing. I understand that there's a limit to how much they can do for every Pokemon that can do this ability, obviously. So whenever Pokemon does terrestrialize, they just look a little bit more crystallized, they're a little bit more sparkly, and they have an emblem that comes out from the top of their head representing the new type that they are, which is fine, I guess, but it just doesn't really look that appealing. I understand that there's no way that they could have made some sort of unique model for every single Pokemon for every single possible Terra type that they could transform into. I know that's unrealistic to expect, and I didn't expect that, but I just feel like what we got didn't really wow me that much, and that might be just kind of the problem we're facing here with obviously so many Pokemon in the game, and with these new mechanics, every single Pokemon has the ability to utilize these new mechanics. But thinking back to Mega Evolutions, not every single Pokemon was able to Mega Evolve, and as a result, the few Pokemon that were able to Mega Evolve, they had really cool designs, and it was more of a spectacle and more exciting to see them transform. Whereas now it's kind of a little bland. And maybe that's just like the issue at hand with the Pokemon series going forward, That's something that seems to be the trend for the foreseeable future. This is going to be a new mechanic, a new gimmick of sorts that is introduced with every generation. If there's no wow factor there, I feel like it's kind of hurting the series more than it's helping it. But ultimately, that's why I do feel like Mega Evolution is the best gimmick that they introduced. And it was the first one they introduced, and I think it peaked back then, back in X and Y. But again, those are just my opinions. I'm really curious to hear what you guys have to say about this. Do you also love Mega Evolutions, or do you like one of the other few gimmicks that were more recently introduced? Also, what do you think the next gimmick is going to be? I personally would love for it to be Pokemon Fusions. I think that would be the only gimmick going forward that I think could top Mega Evolutions for me. Just imagine a Salamence fusing with a Garchomp. But regardless of what they do next, I just hope it's something more visually interesting as well as technically interesting. But that's all I've got to say for this one, guys. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.